Scrum, one of the top 10 most influential Agile thinkers, written a number of books.
Thank you.
And a huge contributor to the Agile mindset, practices and values. Quick show of hands who remembers the show from 80s, 90s, Bill and Ted's. Anyone remember Bill and Ted's? Okay, there's a bit in there where Bill and Ted, they go to their they go to see Alice Cooper, and it's like their hero. So they get there and they're kind of all being very talking Alice Cooper, and then suddenly they're like, we're not worthy, and that's kind of like a good line. So here you go.
School's out. Now, can I? No, that's the wrong kind.
One of those. Great.
What's our announced stop time, Simon?
Well, normally we finish around about 8 in terms of talking, but certainly we can go on a bit longer than that. We will need to leave the room by 9, so we've really got 9. We've got some food coming around about 8, 8:15ish, so we can sort of play around with time a little bit.
This is probably the most entertaining part of the whole evening, so I think I'll just wait for a while. Those beautiful animals. He's got a goat in his backpack. You can't really see that. Oh, the human brain. Oh no, I'm so sad. Too much rice. All right. So I'd like to welcome you here. As some of you might know, my hobby is crap jokes. So let's start with the crap joke of the evening. Man walks into a bar, goes up to the bartender, orders a triple shot of whiskey, and looks depressed. The bartender says, "What's wrong, mate?" And he says, "I think my wife is going deaf and she can't hear anymore." "Oh, that's too bad," said the bartender, "but don't jump to conclusions. Why don't you go home and measure how far away that she can actually hear you?" Good idea. So he goes home, walks into his house, walks into the front living room, sees his wife in there, and he calls to her and he says, "Hey, honey, what should we have for dinner?" "Honey, dinner." Third time, "Hey, honey, what should we have for dinner?" And then he hears, "For the third time, chicken." If you've been married a long time, you actually really understand that joke at a deep level. In ways you didn't want to know. So I'd like to start with a caution. In the 1950s was the first large software-intensive product development, late 50s, early 60s, called the SAGE system. It was a defense system in the US, and it involved hundreds of programmers. It was way over budget and years late to be delivered of the original anticipated goal. And when the smoke cleared, one of the senior managers was interviewed and asked, what would you do different if you could do this again? Find the 10 best people and write the entire thing themselves. And so I'd like to emphasize that really the thing to do is to descale the organization. I've been working in this area for a long time, large, multi-site and offshore development. And here's, after many decades of focusing in this space, the essence of my advice. Don't. The reasons why people believe that they need large numbers of bodies, as though this was a digging a ditch problem, are based upon flawed understanding of the nature of software development and people as nonlinear systems. You may or may not know the relatively well-known meta-analysis study by Preckalt into programmer productivity, which is the largest meta-analysis study. And plotting all other studies done over the years on programmer productivity and lumping them into 4 quartiles of results, he shows that the median programmer productivity measured in function points per person month in the top quartile versus the median in the bottom quartile is a 400% difference. 400%. This is not some single study. This is not one study with bad methodology. This is the largest meta-analysis of all other studies done since the dawn of time on programmer productivity. So it's relatively reliable data. It's something you can remember probably for the rest of your career as a relatively reliable data point. 400%. So the belief that the problem that we need to solve is just with more bodies typing in code is really the wrong way to usually solve the problem. And I like to say a lot of the dynamics in software development are superlinear or nonlinear. So for example, if you, research shows, if your requirements are, this is often surprising to people, if you look at requirements measured, for example, in function points, and you look at the total effort to do a system where the number of function points is twice another one. Suppose, for example, it's 500 function points. Let's keep it simple, 5 person months. Then double the number of function points, not double the effort. It might be 3 to 4 times the effort. Typically, there's superlinear dynamics in software development. And so you don't just double the pain, double the gain. It's not like that. And it's partly related, by the way, to the fact that if you have a background in computer science, you might appreciate that the amount of coupling in a software system increases superlinearly with respect to the number of lines of code. It's not a linear increase. And so because of these dynamics and because of our plains of Africa brains, which are essentially evolved for a very linear world, you push with a force of 3, you expect to get poked with a force of 3, and that's not how things are working. So then from this misunderstanding of the dynamics of R&D, product development, we believe that going larger will give us some kind of predictable kind of benefit. And the key point is that it's quite nonlinear and things hurt a lot more at scale. Multi-site. There's a relatively well-known research study, quite a large one, that shows that multi-site development is twice as slow as single-site development. And there's a number of studies that show offshoring, for example, to India, strongly correlated with loss of money, longer delays, higher defect and failure rates, and so on and so forth. The same true for a lot of so-called low-cost centers. So if you really want to fuck it up, if you really want to have high failure rates, be really inefficient, do big development with lots of sites with low-cost offshore centers. I can hardly think of a better recipe for absolute abject failure. You want great product development, find well-educated computer scientists, ideally with at least a graduate degree in computer science, because that's the hard skill. Other skills, UI, UX, all the other things. There's a reason there's not a university degree in UX. It's not rocket science, and so on and so forth. But the intellectually really hard skill is computer science. So hire a small number of, I often say that software development should have at least a median of 115 to 120 IQ. If you think that you can really succeed in this domain without median IQ of around 115 or so, you're fooling yourself. And go, on the other hand, to an organization with 10 or 20 really well-educated computer scientists who are T-shaped workers, multi-skilled, know how to work in teams, are literally physically at the same table. They've got an IQ 115 plus. They're in direct connection with the real customers and co-creating solutions without levels of indirection and handoff. And see the magic. It's not some complicated recipe. You want cheap, great success? That's the way to do it. But okay, nobody listens to me. So sometimes people ask me what I do for a living, and I say I'm trying to reduce suffering in product development. Because people just got to go through it themselves. There's something very Homo sapien about the fact that you can paint in big, bold letters, "Don't do this," and people got to do it. Here's a view, some pictures of Les. This is all large-scale Scrum, so Scrum is the context. I assume you understand Scrum. In typical one-team Scrum, you got one team and the product owner at Sprint Planning Part 1, but here we got representatives from a whole bunch of teams. But there's only one meeting, Sprint Planning Part 1. So there might be 8 teams, but there's just one meeting with the one product owner and either all the team members in the room or representatives, depending upon how many you can fit in the room. There's 2 frameworks in LESS. There's the smaller LESS framework, which is for up to around 50 people or 8 teams. And then there's the second framework called LESS Huge, which is when you've got hundreds and hundreds of people working on a single product. That's often the world I work in when you're working in big embedded systems, video conferencing, telecommunications, stuff like that. You've often got hundreds of people. And this is a picture of a coordination meeting or technique within a sprint called open space. I bet probably half of the room is familiar with open space. By the way, you might have heard of a technique like Scrum of Scrums. Note, that's a coordination meeting technique, and it's such a trivial, unimportant subject, Scrum of Scrums. I'm, for example, just starting to teach a 3-day course on scaling, and in the 3-day course, I might spend 15 seconds on Scrum of Scrums. It's such a trivial and unimportant and, frankly, relatively unskillful technique in order to solve this problem. It's got virtually nothing to do with real scaling. So if you were to ask someone about scaling and the first thing they were to say is Scrum of Scrums, there's a big red light flashing on top of their head, which is basically saying, I haven't got a frickin' clue what I'm really talking about. One of the activities in Scrum is product backlog refinement. previously called grooming, but actually at my years of advocacy with Ken and Jeff, I said, you got to replace the word grooming. You guys got to go to Britain and understand what a bad word that is. So finally they gave up and changed it to product backlog refinement. And in single team Scrum, you would have the team and the product owner together doing product backlog refinement, PBR, for future sprints. It's never done for the current sprint. But here's an example of another less activity, multi-team PBR, where representatives or all of the members of all of the teams are together in a room. Might talk more about that later on. Sprint review, there's just, if there's 5 teams, there's still just one sprint review meeting with either everyone in the room or team reps. In addition to the normal Scrum events, unless there's overall retrospective, which is for systems level optimization, because the regular retrospective is just for an individual team, but we want to optimize the whole. Now, the team level, single team retrospective ends a sprint, Friday, 5 p.m. You're finished with the team level sprint, a retrospective, so you can't do this at the end of the sprint because it's time to go to the pub. So the overall retrospective happens early-ish in the next sprint, looking back at the previous sprint, and it involves reps from all of the teams and Scrum Masters together. And this not only illustrates overall retrospective, but a multi-site context. And when we're doing multi-site less, we'll often use video conferencing equipment in order to make this better. This is a Xerox product group. This is Rochester. This is Los Angeles, and that's Rochester. And they'll use techniques that we often use in scaling workshoppings that I call diverge and merge cycles, where when you've got large groups of people, you do activities where sometimes you're apart, sometimes you're together, coming together to reduce the wastes of information scatter, but being apart to get some kind of local efficiency of parallelization of work or more ideation and so forth. Less itself can be viewed as composed of these elements. There's 10 core principles. Then there's a framework with a set of rules about it. There's 2 frameworks, actually, less and less huge. There's a set of guides, and then there's 600 experiments. Those of you who have read my, I'm just finishing up my 3rd book on less. If you've read my 2 prior books on less in previous years, you know that it's all basically organized as a set of 600 experiments. And so that's the model. And the guides, you could say, are really, they're a subset of the total experiments. The guides are a much smaller subset that we feel are really important to pay attention to and more likely adopt, because 600 is a big list. There's the LESS website. I didn't have time to connect to a Wi-Fi network here. Is it easy to get onto a Wi-Fi network here?
No.
All right. Then imagine this is a web page. And this is the home page, and it's all clickable, and it's kind of graphics all the way down. So you can go into all of this stuff and learn all about LESS through a very sort of friendly visual model. And there's lots of material there to help you learn, so I encourage you to go there. In order to support LESS, we've created a trainer program now, and in 2015 there's about, let's say, 40 or so candidate LESS trainers that are being prepared in order to effectively coach and support the world community that's adopting LESS more. I myself have been primarily interested in doing the real work. I've kind of focused my career as just doing consulting and coaching inside of companies. So I've never been particularly interested in marketing or growing a business or money per se. And that's why, even though I created LESS years ago and I've been focusing in large scale for years, and some of you may have seen my keynotes here in London over the years on LESS. This is not at all a new subject, and I've keynoted years past here on the subject. But I haven't really tried to make it really popular because it's just not my bag to market and grow businesses. It's not my interest. But now there's kind of such a demand around the world for it. I've tried to now systematize it and create a lot more resources to make it easier to adopt with trainers. And the new book that I'm writing more with less and so forth to make it easier for people. Skip this and pick up some material. Let's talk a little bit about me, not because I'm a narcissist, but just maybe so you understand my background. Well, maybe I am a narcissist. So I'm the co-author along with Bas Foda, and I kind of focus on these domains. Often in the UK, you can imagine which of those domains I'm usually involved in the most. Years ago, wrote these books on large-scale Scrum or less. And this is really, if you have these books or know about them, this is really volume 1, volume 2. They need to be read in this order because there's kind of like 3 major categories of knowledge in less. The first is the thinking tools, which includes systems thinking, queuing theory, lean thinking, and some other thinking tools. Because where do organizational designs come from? Organizational designs come from our minds. And so really the root cause of mistakes in organizational design is in our thinking mistakes, our assumptions that the domain is linear when it's superlinear, or so on and so forth. And so a lot of the work that I do is really at the level of debugging mental models. The second major area of knowledge of less are the organizational tools, because primarily, and this is not just true of less, but really of anything at scale of any significance, it is not a method, not a process, not a technique, it is an organizational design. And by that I mean groups, roles, responsibilities, processes. That's what less is. It is a full-scale organizational design with impacts from how you design HR to how you do the concept of budgeting. Soup to nuts, less or real Scrum touches everything in the organization. And so if you were to classify my job title, it's really, the classic term would be an organizational design consultant. But I like to say I try to reduce suffering in product development. And then after the foundations of fixing the thinking tools, at least to start with, changing the organizational design, then we move on to the most unimportant subject, which are practices and techniques. And that's what this volume is about. And there's a new book coming out. And many years ago, I wrote this book, one of the first books on Agile development. Anyone read this book, just to have a sense? Served as chief scientist at Valtech. We've got a center in Bengaluru, India, for example. And while I've been living in India on and off since 1978, and while there helped create Agile Offshore Development. These are some of our teams in Bengaluru who are working in a less way. I worked at Xerox for a long time, served as lead coach of lean software development. A lot of my work is not just in pure software, but electrical, mechanical, optical, and software systems, so a combination of all of those things. So a lot of hardware and software together, building these kinds of things, digital presses. And that involves an interesting collaboration between mechanical engineers, pure digital engineers, software engineers, and so forth. And so we use less to build these kinds of things, or Tandberg, Cisco video conferencing systems, that kind of stuff I tend to work in. I've introduced less over the last 10 years at a whole bunch of places. Some places very strongly. Ericsson, anyone here work for Ericsson? Ericsson, kind of a very broad top to bottom less adoption amongst their product groups. I worked in a whole bunch of telecom companies over the years, and also in various investment banks. Yeah. And these are some of the websites I've created. Okay, moving on. was all by way of just introduction. I'm trying to choose my words because it is a subject, since it involves truly every aspect of organizational design. You can basically turn me on, and for the next 5 days, 10 hours a day, I could just talk nonstop just to introduce the beginning implications of LESS, because it literally touches every aspect of the system. So I'm trying to decide what I want to focus on. I think I'll focus first of all on a key structural element. Yeah, let's start with group structure, roles, and responsibilities. These are the LESS principles, and the one that's highlighted here is that large-scale Scrum is Scrum. So what I mean by this is that you might be exposed to some approaches to scaling where essentially you've got Scrum at the single team level, but on top of that you've got something completely different. So there are various frameworks where essentially it's Scrum for the team, but above that it's not actually Scrum, it's just something else on top of it. But what we've done in Scrum, in large-scale Scrum, is something different. We've asked the question, what are the principles and goals in one team Scrum? Systems optimization, transparency, empirical process control. And then asked how those ideas at one team Scrum can be scaled up and how they apply at a larger scale, rather than just kind of naively just taking a bunch of Scrum teams and trying to stick them together. So this section on feature teams is related to this notion of large-scale Scrum is Scrum. So the Scrum Guide is the Bible of Scrum, and this is a quote from the Scrum Guide. I'd like to invite you to read that, please. If your entire company is 7 people, this makes perfect sense, and basically your 7-person company is going to be organized this way. So the implications of this apparently innocuous statement don't loom large in a single team company, a company with 7 people. But when you turn the dial up on the number of people in the product group, then the implications of this start to become more noteworthy. And so now we're moving into some of the structure topics of LESS, feature teams, teams, and organizing by customer value. So when I come into an organization, because I'm always working in a large-scale context where the single product group is 350 people or 1,000 people or 75 people, it'll look more like this when I get there for a single product. What do I mean by component teams? This is a component, I mean a chunk of code, an architectural unit of code. Trivial example, suppose you're creating an application that has a UI through the browser. Then there will be code in the browser, JavaScript, HTML. And in theory, you could have a group of programmers, the browser JavaScript programmers, who just do that layer of the code. And suppose it's then attached to a server, and there's a back-end server services done in Java. And suppose you had another group that did the back-end, so they do the front-end code, they do the back-end code. Then you've got chunks of code in your system. You have the notion of private code, and you've got different teams attached to different chunks of the code. That's what I mean by component teams. And you don't see that in the small-scale world. Like, for example, I remember reading an article by Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, and he just programs across the entire stack, because obviously that's what any intelligent programmer would do. The notion of dividing up the programmers into working on different little layers would never normally arise amongst skilled, sensible programmers who are starting off small. It's a kind of a disease of bad scaling organizational design. But it happens. So that's where we start. And to make it clear, I raise this point because one of the things I've noticed with the introduction of real Scrum, not fake Scrum, which seems to be endemic, is that the principle of Scrum, coming way back here, have all the competencies needed to accomplish the work end-to-end customer features without depending on others not part of the team. The implications of that, they don't end there, but these people are special. And this is, you could say, one of Larman's laws. The degree to which an organization will flip to cross-functional teams is proportional to the lack of power, lack of authority, and lack of respect of the role of the person in the organization. So you're a crappy programmer or tester, shut up, you get into the Scrum team. But if you're one of the important people, oh no, we're too special for joining a cross-functional team. We're the special people. And every decade has a new variant of that. 15 years ago, it was the architects who said, we're the special people. And these days, it's a person with a degree in 14th century French literature who heard from one of their friends that, hey, you can get into this software development business and become a UX expert and make a decent living at it, and that's all they can do. And then they call themselves the special people, and they couldn't be possibly part of a cross-functional team. So always somebody wants to say they're special, and they've got some justification why they're more special than anybody else. I'd like to share with you that you are all special to me in your own special ways, but you're not that special. And the idea is you are so special, you all get to be part of a cross-functional team. Every damn one of you. There's, in real Scrum, not fake Scrum, there's no UX team. There's no such thing as a Scrum UX team. There's no architecture group. There's no Scrum architecture group. There's no database group. There's no Scrum BA group. Every one of these groups, every one, this is the definition of real Scrum. This is not even just less. This is just plain old Scrum and the implications of it at scale. Every one of those groups is eliminated. Literally eliminated. And all of these groups had managers, by the way, which means that all of those positions, and in fact the roles, the role of single function manager, UX manager, BA manager, all of those roles are eliminated. Now, shifting to the implication of adoption and transition, how long does this take? 1 hour. People often say to me, oh, it's so hard to change the organization from that to getting rid of all of that. It's really hard. No, it's, well, literally takes around 1 second. to actually decide to do it, because it's just ideas. Ideas take 1 second to change. So I'm in a room with the head of R&D or the CEO or the CIO or whoever has the ability to tear up the org chart and eliminate positions and roles like that. And there is someone in the organization who has that level of authority. And to cut to the quick, that's who you have to work with to introduce meaningful organizational change. You can't do this bottom up. It just doesn't work. So I need to get into the room with whomever is at a powerful enough level where they can just decide we're shutting down that site, we're eliminating these roles, we're throwing out the HR policies, career paths, we're eliminating all these positions. And that takes literally about 1 second to decide and another minute to verbalize. So it doesn't take long to change organizations at all once you're at the right level of power. So that's what we do in LESS. We just flip the system like that. And then how do you actually flip the system, all of these groups, into cross-functional teams of real Scrum teams? Well, usually about an hour. So let's suppose it's like 50 people total in these groups. You get them all in a room like this. You start off with a meeting about what you're looking for in an ideal canonical team. About 7 people, skills from all of these different areas, not all of the stars in one team, diversity of gender, all 4, and so forth. And then I'll back up. Years ago here in London, I was working at BAML in EMEA Ops Securities, if that means anything to you guys. And we were going to do this, and I'd gone away. I'd worked with the senior management team. They'd agreed to flip the system, but then I'd gone away, and they were going to come back and actually do it. And when I came back after a couple of months, the senior manager invited me into his office and said, "Craig, I'd like to show you the org chart of the new cross-functional teams and who's going to be in them and so forth." And he showed me the paper, and I picked up the paper and very, let's say dramatically, I just tore it up into little bits and dropped it in the wastebasket. Because one of the other Scrum principles, because large-scale Scrum is Scrum, is self-organizing teams. Self-organizing teams. Explain to me how self-organizing teams squares with a manager deciding who the teams are and who's in the teams. It makes no sense at all. It's completely inconsistent with real Scrum. So how do you form these teams? It's none of your business. Get out of the way. So in the room, all that we have is the 50 people, a facilitator. They're all adults. They can figure this out for themselves. They figured out the canonical team. We start the clock for 10 minutes, and people themselves figure out the new teams that they want to create. Nascent teams form over a 10-minute period. There might be some kind of speed dating that goes on. And then ding, the bell goes. There'll be these amorphous nascent teams around the room. And then we'll do a gap analysis of this current so-called team against our ideal state. There'll always be various kinds of gaps. And then we'll have a short discussion about that, point them out. We'll start the clock for another 10-minute cycle, and we'll repeat those cycles until it shakes itself out. Usually we might have to get into a little bit of matchmaking where the facilitator might say, well, you guys have got 2 people whose primary skill is BA, and there's none in this team. Team, would you like to say something to the other team? And then with a little bit of hand-holding, then eventually it kind of stabilizes.
But when you're doing that,
yeah.
it's all that everyone's focused on the same product.
The same?
On the same product.
Yes. Yes.
What if you're delivering multiple products?
That's not the context of LESS. Large-scale Scrum is when you've got many teams on one product, not one team on many products. So I don't have anything to say about that. Except that research shows that there's a significant reduction in productivity amongst developers who multitask across different products. And so I discourage it from that point of view. Less also draws from lean thinking. You might notice the title of my books, Scaling Lean and Agile Development. I served as the lead coach of lean development in Xerox. A lot of my background is lean. And one of the key Toyota principles, if you've studied the history of Toyota, they just hate to lay anybody off. They'll do anything in their power to avoid laying anybody off. And in the entire history of Toyota, since the company was founded, they had one and only one layoff, I think, phase in the entire history of the company, when they were just forced to, at crisis, lay some people off. I'm not talking about not firing people. They'll fire a screw-up. I'm talking about layoffs due to other constraints. So they'll move to job sharing, everyone volunteering to take reductions in salary and so forth. So this is central to lean and therefore central to less. This respect for people and at all possible costs avoid anybody losing a job. So in this significant change, that's a central message that the leadership has to communicate and walk the talk about. And it's not only a matter of respect, it also has we could say, a selfish quality to it, because people are not going to improve themselves out of a job. If you set up a change initiative where the trajectory of the change initiative is, hey, we'd like you to keep improving so that we can eliminate your job and fire you, the change is going to be subverted and, of course, just kill all morale and intrinsic motivation in the organization. So it's very important that that doesn't happen in a less adoption. So, how long does this take? Well, I'll be in a typical pattern for me is a senior management team wants me to come in. I'll assign to them a reading of about 300 pages they have to read. If I don't do that, I won't even bother to come, because clearly the senior management is not interested in learning and leading by being themselves teachers. But if they pass that gate, then they have to spend 3 days in a room with me, the C-level management, and if they agree to that, otherwise I won't show up. If they agree to that, then usually at the end of those 3 days, I call it informed consent, so that at the end of those 3 days, they either decide to flip the system or we're not going to do this, and I'm fine in either case. But then if they decide to flip the system, how long does it take after that? 1 hour. So then there might be a pause where we all prepare for this, whatever that might mean, and then come back 1 hour later, the whole system is flipped. It's that simple. Now, what it exposes is a world of hurt, because this traditional organization has all kinds of weaknesses and dysfunctions that are hidden in the traditional organizational design. And when you flip the system to real cross-functional feature teams, all of this is painfully exposed. Knowledge debt, and so on and so forth. And so the consequences of this are enormous, and you'll spend a significant amount of time for the next year or so revealing all of these weaknesses and then working them out.
What would you do with your managers?
Well, it depends. For example, in some organizations, there's a requirement for what I call in Canada line management, where groups of people have to report to someone. And typically the functional managers are not only often sort of experts on their function, they often play the role of line managers for their functional group. And if we move to cross-functional feature teams, and if you're an organization that still needs line managers, well, they might be able to play that role. You might not need as many, because unless we try to move to a flatter organization, for example, 3 or 4 or 5 feature teams, let's say, for example, 7 times 4, 28, 30 people reporting to one line manager. So that could absorb some of them. But notice then they're a line manager of 4 cross-functional teams. So there'll be very little relationship between their prior functional skill and the people that are now reporting to them. That's one possibility. Another possibility, even better, is if they can become makers again, if they can actually do the real hands-on value work. Because from the point of view of lean thinking or Toyota, all management is waste. I don't know if that's clear to you. So the Toyota view is they think of themselves as, imagine I have to take cash out of my pocket and give it to people for something I want to create. And I look at the people around me, let's say I want a car, and there's people who are actually physically creating the car. I'll give them money. And there'll be other people that are called managers, and they're not making my car. And so from my point of view as the paying customer, all the managers are overhead waste and therefore undesirable. In Toyota, the perfection vision would be you would have no managers and only makers. That's a classically lean vision. And so in a lean company, the prime place to go for everybody is to become a maker, a hands-on worker again. The analogy that I often like to give, the way I encourage people to think about this, is hospitals and workers in hospitals. Imagine you're a heart surgeon and you're 50 years old and you go to dinner with somebody that you don't know, and they say, so what do you do for a living? And you say, well, I'm a heart surgeon, a 50-year-old heart surgeon. And they go, oh man, you've really fucked up your career. How come you're not a manager at the hospital yet? You're still a heart surgeon at 50? You know, it doesn't make any sense. It's like ridiculous that you would actually value the overhead role of managers. In a hospital, it's crystal clear that all managers and overhead staff are just overhead, and you would like to get rid of as many of them as possible, and you would like to have people being heart surgeons and hands-on nurses until the day that they retire. That's what a lean company is like, and that's what lean software development organizations are therefore like. They're full of hands-on programmers. I'm a really old guy. I'm quite sure I'm a lot older than anybody in the room. What am I? I'm a coder. You know, I don't pump myself up with fake titles like architect or consultant or whatever. I'm a coder, and I'll be a coder until the day I retire. Because it takes 6 years of university and 20 to 30 years of hard effort to become a decent coder. It's like being a heart surgeon. It's really frickin' hard to do this well, to become a master programmer. And imagine we have a company filled with master programmers who are multi-skilled and are great at user-centered design and can program, and like I can program in, you know, after doing this for 40 years, I can program in 20 to 30 languages quite well. And you can too. There's nothing special about me. I'm just average. And so a company full of people who are master programmers, great at user-centered design, and can do great requirements analysis and da-da-da-da-da-da. How incredibly effective, efficient, good use of your money you're going to have in an organization. So part of what less is about, which really comes from lean, is people shifting back to becoming hands-on workers and creating a culture that values that, which of course leads to the corollary that that's what you pay for. You pay people to be programmers until they retire. There was a hanging question? Yeah. Well, no one's fired again. Remember, it's job safety, but not role safety. And certainly, yes, the identification of all of the roles and positions that will be eliminated are part of that. Well, it depends. First of all, if they reacted bad, now imagine I'm the shareholder or the investor in the company. Why would I care? Am I paying people's salary to be in overhead positions? Lean thinking is always from the point of view of the paying customer. If we've got overhead managers who actually just want to promote overhead, and I'm the paying customer, I'm sorry that you're not comfortable with this, but I'm not paying for overhead. Lean is always thinking about from the person who's funding the payroll. And to jump ahead, by the way, a little later on, I might talk about Larman's laws of organizational behavior. So I've been involved in change initiatives for a long time. And not just less, but let's say Six Sigma, Lean, Total Quality Management. And I'm not sure what the number is, but let's say that on average, 6 out of 10 change initiatives in any of these systems, Six Sigma, less, Lean, whatever, fail, let's say. Why is that? And for a long time, I didn't know or couldn't get clear on it until I finally boiled it down to Larman's laws of organizational behavior. Law number 1, organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for managers and specialists. They're not optimized for delivering customer value. They're optimized to maintain the status quo for managers, especially middle managers and single specialists. Law number 2, as a corollary to law number 1, the change initiative's new terminology will be overloaded to mean the same as status quo. Right? So, as an example, yesterday I was called the project manager. Now I'm the Scrum Master. Everything's the same, but now the labels have changed. Or whatever. Oh, we're the UX Scrum team. We're the Agile UX team. We're the Agile analysis team. We're the Agile testing team. It's complete nonsense, but the labels have changed in order to pervert what the change initiative is really trying to do. Law number 3, as a corollary to law number 1, the change initiative will be derided as purist, theoretical, revolutionary, and requiring customization for pragmatic local concerns. And these are the 2 moves that are made by the specialists and the managers in order to prevent any actual challenge to their status quo. The move of redefining the new terminology to mean the same and deriding the change initiative to deflect it from anything that it would actually challenge the existing status quo. What's that? Yeah, right. Yeah, I often like to say change teams are designed to avoid change. Yeah.
Where would you draw the Scrum Masters from then?
So, this is an experiment we in the Scrum community have run hundreds of thousands of times probably. And if you've done the Certified Scrum Master course, you might know that there's a common exercise in it called the Project Management Task Exercise. Have you ever done that exercise? So I'll briefly sketch it out. So how it works is that you write on paper what are all of the project management tasks. For example, status reporting, or planning, or estimating, or communicating, or coordinating. There's a list, whatever it is. And usually when we do this exercise, you end up with a list of around 20 things. So that was the project management tasks. Then what, and this is one of the classic CSM exercises. Then you create sheets of paper called Scrum Master, Product Owner, Team, Other, and Not Applicable. And you take all of those tasks, which are on separate cards, and you classify them under these roles and responsibilities according to the rules of Scrum. And what ends up happening, and I've done this exercise with people easily several hundred times, what ends up happening is the papers look like this. Notice, there's nothing under the Scrum Master role. And this is meant to make the point, and if this wasn't taught to you in the CSM, you got incorrectly taught. One of the teachings in the CSM is that project managers make crap Scrum Masters because what they are skilled at has got zero to do with what real, not fake Scrum Masters, what real Scrum Masters do. Real Scrum Masters teach Scrum, which has got zero to do with traditional project management.
So would you bring them in from outside then?
I don't like to. One of the lean principles is to grow from within. And so I always prefer that. There are situations where you need to prime the pump with an outside viral agent, and yeah, that's okay. I'm a huge fan of building up companies' own internal strengths. That's why over the years, various kinds of consulting companies have tried to hire me. But it's never, they end up never doing it because typically the MO, the modus operandi of these companies, is that they want to introduce a problem to a company that says, oh, you need all of these coaches and consultants and so forth. And then they can bill a lot. But my approach is, man, I want to get out of here as fast as possible. I want it to cost you nothing. And you need to build these capabilities for yourself. That's where I'm coming from as a lean coach. So when we flip the system an hour later, this is what we start to get. Cross-functional, cross-component feature teams. And there's, as you might know in Scrum, there's no such thing as a UX person or a tester. There's no such thing as a programmer. There's no such thing as an architect. All of this is illegal in the rules of Scrum. There's only one role, one title allowed in Scrum, and that's called product developer. That's it in the official rules of Scrum. So this means that you have to literally go to the HR group. Like for example, at JP Morgan a couple of years ago, when we started to flip the organizational design, there were all these different career paths. There were business analyst 1, business analyst 2, there was, DBA 1, there was programmer 1, da-da-da-da. So we had to eliminate all of those, get rid of all of those career paths, and now at JP Morgan, there's just one job title, period, in IT, and that's developer or product developer. That's it. And there's 5 categories, product developer 1 through product developer 5, and that's it. And that's what a real Scrum organization is like. And this also now, I'm alluding to one of the implications of what you have to do in real large-scale Scrum as opposed to faking it, is you have to literally change the HR policies, because otherwise it would just be faking it. So once again, you have to be at a high enough level with senior leadership where you can actually change this stuff. And if you really do this, by the way, it's quite wonderful what happens in terms of the quality, agility, efficiency that you get out of the organization. And then what do we give to a team? We just give to a team a real feature, and they do everything for that feature, soup to nuts. All the code across the entire stack, they do the analysis, they do the UX, they do the end-to-end testing and so forth. It's a dramatically simpler model as well. I think I'll skip this stuff. So that touches upon one element. I think another element I'll briefly touch upon is component teams. You'll notice, by the way, that in this brief introduction, I'm hardly talking at all about the trivial subjects of how to do sprint planning 1 or so forth. None of those, it's so trivial, it's hardly worth even talking about. You can learn that stuff in 10 minutes. The interesting, hard, and important part of what less is about is fixing the root cause problems in the system. So what I'm pointing to here are the really important things that have to be changed, the systemic organizational design stuff. That's where the focus of less is, not at trivial, superficial subjects like how do you do a sprint review when you've got 6 teams and so forth. That's meaningless. Another important subject is the question of component teams, and I want to play this out a little bit. These boxes represent chunks of code. And in large-scale development, you can describe your system as full of chunks of code, and the names vary: modules, systems, components, and I'll just call them components. Every system has components, which are these logical chunks of code that we think of as distinct in some way. The JavaScript code that all goes into the browser, it's like a distinct chunk of code. A chunk of code running in a separate OS process which does some type of a tax calculation or whatever. Now, what component teams are is when you then attach to these chunks of code programmers, let's say. So here's a product group with ostensibly 9 major architectural components and 5, 6, 7 people attached to any of these components. And this you wouldn't have a feel for what I'm talking about. You'll understand it. You wouldn't have a feel for what I'm talking about if you work in a small-scale world. But in a large-scale world where one product composes all of this, then you've got teams associated with chunks of code, and there's private code ownership. So these people own this code, and you want to change this code, this group can't touch it. You're going to have to do some kind of interaction. Anyone work in this scale of group? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Now, let's look at, and maybe it's occluded over there. Let me come over here. F1, a true customer-centric feature. Settled trades in the Kenya market. Okay, true, proper customer end-to-end feature. It's unlikely that that will only involve changes in one component. Possible, but much more likely is that. For example. So that's the situation. If we're organized into component teams, let's look at how we have to play things out. Let's look at the story of F1. The first thing that we need to do is analyze it and understand it in some way. What does the requirement mean? What does it mean to settle a trade in the Kenya market? So, I'll ask a rhetorical question. Which of these component teams is going to do the requirements analysis or business analysis? It's not at all clear. In fact, you might not even know that these components are going to be associated with F1 at this moment. So you can't even necessarily say that. And in the worlds that I work in, it's actually not 9 components, it's 150 or 400 components, and there's 700 people, and so it's a lot more difficult to see what belongs where. So how do we solve that problem? Rhetorical question. We introduce a group. And the group are called BAs or RAs or some variant of that. And they'll create some kind of a document that summarizes their analysis. Note bene. This organizational group, this element, is begat because you have a component team structure. It's very important that you understand what I just said. This is a side effect of having made that choice. Once that's your constraint, you are driven to that, to solve that first problem that I just told you about. The next problem that we need to answer is what components? And if your entire world is 5 components, people can probably just pop it out in 3 seconds what the answer is. But in the worlds I work in, where it's quite large, actually you'll need some kind of a matrix. And there'll be some kind of a matrix of features, components, literally usually done in a spreadsheet. And then somebody has to think it through and, to the best of their ability, answer something like that. And this would be unfamiliar to you if you work in a small world. This will only be familiar if you work in a large world. Now, who is going to answer that question? Is it going to be one of these teams? Can't be. It's a chicken and egg problem. What do we have to do? We're going to have to introduce another group. And this group goes by names like systems engineering or the architecture group. Usually it's those 2 titles. Rarely have I seen it to be any other. Sometimes it's a title called project manager, but they're really fulfilling this technical analysis role. And they'll create some kind of other document, which might include, by the way, not only that matrix that I just showed you, but, for example, there has to be some kind of interaction between those 2 components, software. Who's going to define this API? Will it be that team or that team? Well, because a lot of organizations are so unskillful at effective collaboration, there's a dynamic that I call the X manager for X problem dynamic. So we got a quality problem. Let's make a quality manager. We got a architecture problem. Let's make an architecture manager. And because organizations are so unskillful, and I lay this at the feet of all managers for this, because it should be the proper remit of managers to be really skillful in all of this stuff and teach people it, but most aren't. Most managers are pretty crap at their jobs, I observe. Then this is just handled by some intermediate group. The architect will define the interface. Is that something else that they do? The next problem that we need to solve, now that we've identified the ostensible end-to-end requirement, and we've identified the 3 component teams involved, is we have to figure out, what does that team exactly do? What does that team exactly do? So we can give them a work package of the work that they need to do, some kind of a document. Who's going to do that? Well, again, it can't be the component teams. It's a chicken and egg problem. So we introduce another group who takes this stuff, primarily this stuff, and this group, ultimately, in this example where there's 3 component teams, does this. Figures out the work for the 3 components related to F1. And the names vary. Sometimes it's called feature manager, sometimes it's BA, sometimes it's project manager. The name varies on who does that particular work. Next, we have now the component teams, and they can do their part of the programming. Next step, they create code, and the code is not necessarily, in fact rarely, integrated as they write it. Well, why is that? Well, one reason is, and I'll reiterate this point later on, this is not all happening on Tuesday. In other words, it's not happening synchronized. Because in fact, there's F1, F2, F50 flowing through the system at the same time. It's an important point to understand here. So in reality, it's not like, you flow one through and then F1 and you flow F through 2. No, it's 50 of them going on at the same time, and there's queues in front of all of these groups where work is getting piled up. And if the work isn't getting piled up, then they're doing it in a multitasking mode, where this team on Tuesday might be doing a little bit on F2 and a little bit on F7. This is why, for example, you'll go to traditional groups and you'll say, so what are you working on? And someone will say, well, I'm 25% on project 1, I'm 40% on project 2, right? That's all a side effect of this organizational structure. So coming back to the integration point, for example, years ago when I was in Hangzhou, China, I worked with a product group where before they flipped to less, this group, for a particular requirement, did their part of F1 11 months before this group did their part of F1. 11 months. So it all starts to get done out of order. So it's not like this all is integrated together. They might be doing it on separate branches or so on and so forth. So who's going to integrate it, finally, once it's all together? Will it be one of these teams? No. Let's introduce another group. Let's call them the, systems integration team. And they'll be responsible for actually integrating it all together. Next, we have to do the end-to-end testing. Who's going to do the end-to-end testing of F1? It's clearly not one of those teams. What do we have to do? Let's introduce another group called the Systems Integration Testing Group, or some variation of that. Furthermore, the work has been chopped up so much that you can drop the ball on it, and so we need someone to keep track of it across all of this. So how do we solve that problem? We need a project manager or a feature manager. So all of this overhead is introduced as a side effect, as kind of a summarizing point. All of this is introduced as a side effect of your original decision to organize with component teams. And what does this look like in terms of a life cycle? This is, it's that, but this is a sequential life cycle. And you can overlay this with all of the agile adjectives you want, but that is just an illusion. I want you to strip away all terminology and look at the system. And this is a classic sequential life cycle with high levels of work in progress, high levels of handoff. And we know from software engineering research that this model is associated with the most cost overruns and the most schedule overruns of any possible organizational design. If by evidence, you can't make it any worse than this. If you want to say, Craig, according to evidence, what's the worst possible organizational design I should come up with, this would be the logical choice if you actually study the research. And yet, isn't it therefore ironic that actually this is how stuff gets set up, which illustrates how poor the quality of managers are? It gets better. I'm not even near done with what's really going on here. For example, let's consider doing the most valuable customer-centric work in the organization through this system. So let's create a list of requirements, and we'll just call them 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, and there's 20. And these real customer-centric requirements are sorted by some kind of customer value, real impact on the business order. But remember, these requirements actually are going to be split across lots of component teams, right? When you've got component teams. So, and it's not just one that's going through the system at a time. It can be like 30 or 50 of them going through at a time. And let's say, for example, that one of the component teams is component team, I don't know, C7. And let's suppose that the first requirement that includes any C7 coding is requirement number 10, as an example. So I could elaborate on this, but maybe I'll try to make it short and you'll get my point. So what you do in this model is you optimize around giving work to the people to keep them busy. You're not optimizing around customer value. You give the work to C7. So suppose, we start, it's day one. What do we give to this team? We give them part of requirement number 10 because that's all that they can do. So we're not optimizing the organization in terms of customer value. We're prioritizing according to what can we next give to a group to keep them busy. So it's a local optimization by the component specialization rather than a systems optimization by value. That's a key point to understand, because this model then just doesn't give you all the ills that I've alluded to before. It dramatically sub-optimizes your entire system in terms of delivery. You're constrained around a different thing. That's a big problem. It gets better. Suppose that we're greenfield and it's the first time, let me actually come back here. No, I'll do it here. It's kind of messy there. Okay. It's greenfield, it's release 1. These are the component teams that we set up. And it's the first few months of the new product. And not that I would ever recommend doing this. You should start with one team and only add when it really hurts, but let's say. And let's say that in this first release, you added programmers to these different components such that they were basically staffed, well balanced to the flow of work that has to go through the system. Okay, let's just say that was theoretically possible. But now we come to release number 2. Oh, and by the way, every one of these components gets a manager, component manager. Now we come to release number 2. And let's say, to keep it simple, that in release number 2, these are the components where most of the important work is, and there needs to be a lot of work done for the high-value requirements in those areas. And really, hardly anything has to be done in terms of these components. So, what one would say in an ideal universe is, hey, let's have all these programmers come over here and help out. Well, Larman's first law comes into play. Organizations are implicitly optimized to maintain the status quo for managers and specialists. So For example, years ago I used to coach at a company called Sprint, which is a telecom operator in the US. They had a policy that to become a senior program manager, you first of all have had to have led a project with at least 100 people in it. Can you predict how many 100-person projects there were in Sprint? So the story comes, oh, we want to move your people over here. So what does this person say? Oh no, can't do that. This work is very complicated and they couldn't possibly learn that code. Programmers couldn't do that thing. Which is really ironic because a typical computer science graduate goes through 4 years or 5 years of university where they take 5 complex courses every semester for 5 years, through differential calculus to operating system design to da-da-da-da-da. They leave the university, they enter the door of some building, and they say, oh, you couldn't possibly learn a little bit of new code that you haven't seen before. That would blow your mind. So notice that the constraint here is by this false belief that programmers can't learn new code. And we're going to come back to this point a little bit later on as well. So it doesn't move over there, and instead these people are all clamoring to get done, and the business side are clamoring to get one. So what do? Staff up. Now, what do these people do? They got to be busy. So they do make work, where either they work on real low-value stuff, so thinking at a systems level, now your whole system is sub-optimizing because you got a whole bunch of people working on low-value stuff because you're optimizing for busyness rather than anything else. And what do? They pump out code. Now let me share with you something very basic. What's the most cost-effective software system? The one with 0 lines of code. And every extra line of code you add is undesirable. You want a good productivity metric for programmers? They're negative lines of code count. How many lines of code they remove from the system every day? Because every line of code is bad, not good. I sometimes work in the nuclear power industry in the US, and one of the things they do in nuclear is they enforce code reviews a lot. And the overarching, consistent, single question in each code review is, can we delete that line of code? Because they are crystal clear on a very correct understanding that every line of code is a problem, not an advantage. And so they make these components more complicated, and there's more duplication and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's release 2. Release number 3. In release number 3, this is where the important new requirements are, and not over here. Oh, we need some more people to get this done. Hey, could you come and help out over here? No. And the code's very complicated. You couldn't possibly understand that. Okay, let's add some more programmers. And so now you have this ever-growing organization, which is a side effect of this choice of starting with component teams. And now you get into this vicious cycle because they start generating more and more code to keep busy. And then it creates an illusion of complexity. How the hell did we get 700 people in this group? What happened? How the hell did we get 100 million lines of code? I work as a programmer, and I would say that in most of the systems I work in, somewhere between half and 3/4 of the code is just duplicate of stuff I see somewhere else in the code base. And it's all a side effect of this. It gets better. Well, at least, you say, Craig, at least we get high quality code from this group, because this group has really focused on this code. At least you get that. Well, if you believe that, then you're clearly not a skilled programmer. Because I've been working as a programmer for 40 years, and I come into these organizations and I sit down and I look at this code. And here's what happens. Very typical scenario is that people know about some of my older books like Applying UML and Patterns, and they know that I care about great design and good architecture and so forth. And so I'll commonly sit down with them, I'll start to work with them, we'll bring up the code on a common projector, or I'll sit with someone, and invariably one of the first things they say when they know Craig's coming in to look at the code is, they'll say, Craig, we know it's ugly, but we understand it. Because the reality, when you're a master programmer and you look at the code that these component teams make, it's an hellacious, god-awful mess. I hardly can imagine worse code than code that I see coming out of these component teams. How could that happen? Because a naive manager who hasn't programmed in 30 years, who has a degree in 14th century French literature and doesn't understand what's going on, can't even comprehend this and only understands things at a superficial level with wrong causation dynamics, incorrectly believes that you've got good code. But here's what really happens. So we're at some steady state where there's 4 programmers and then a new programmer joins, fresh out of university. And the new programmer comes in and it's their first programming job, and then what does that new programmer do for the next 4 years? They work on that same 10,000 lines of code, and that's it, with the same 4 other people. Now, if you've worked hard at the craft of programming, you tell me that that's how you become a great programmer. That's the exact opposite of how you become a great programmer. You learn 0 by staring at the same 10,000 lines of code and working with the same 4 programmers. So the learning and improvement amongst the programmers drops to almost nothing. Secondly, the code is crap. Complicated, obfuscated, long, duplication everywhere. And you come in and look at it with fresh eyes at the new programmer coming from university says, wow, this is really complicated. And the old guys say, well, yeah, but tell you what, you keep looking at it for the next 6 months and you'll start to understand it. And that's the dynamic. Rather than the new guy coming in and saying, man, we got to clean this up, they say, oh no, it's really complicated. And you just need to stare at it long enough and then you'll understand it. And after 6 months, the switch flips in your brain and you've been staring at it for so long, you can't even smell the garbage anymore. And suddenly all the complexity evaporates and this hellaciously, artificially complex chunk of code looks perfectly normal to you. And you don't even see it anymore. And then for the next 4 years, there's no feedback loop of people coming in and saying, holy crap, that's a frickin' mess. There's none of that at all. They don't even know what clean code is. And so ironically, with component teams, you get the worst code rather than the best code. That's what happens with component teams. And so that's why in large-scale Scrum, we not only dissolve all the single function groups to create cross-functional teams, but we dissolve all of the single component groups to create feature teams which are cross-component, drawing from these different groups. So that now you've got a team of people with programmers whose primary skill is across a suite of components and people whose primary skill is different functions from BA to UX to test or whatever. And then everyone takes on a secondary and a tertiary skill. So the person previously known as the UX expert takes on a secondary skill of automated test. And the person previously known as the programmer of component 1 who has been drawing since age 10 and just loves to sketch turns out to have a wonderful talent in graphic arts or whatever. And one of the things I've learned over the decades doing this is, and this is one of the, related to one of the lean wastes, one of the lean wastes is called not utilizing people's full potential. And one of the things that's amazed me over the years is having a person who was so-called just a UI designer or a UX designer or a technical writer or a programmer then get exposed to the opportunity to learn a secondary skill and to see them shine. because often these people are very bright and capable of so much more, but they've been locked into a 1905 Frederick Taylorist kind of model where a person can only do one kind of thing. It's extremely unskillful, and it's related to a thinking mistake and not seeing what's really going on. Well, that's an extremely short introduction to some of the important topics in large-scale Scrum. Not the trivial stuff like how you do the handling of the events, but fixing the system, which is what it's really about. And now what we're going to do is do a sort of structured Q&A for a while. And how we're going to do it is that you're going to form together into groups of roughly 4 people, 3 or 4 people. So for example, you could turn around and get together with these people and so forth. And in your small cluster, what I want you to do is talk together and generate 3, 4, 5 questions. And I'm going to start the clock for 2 minutes. And then after 2 minutes, we're going to come back together. And then I'm going to be taking questions across the groups. Find a group and generate some. Yeah. Yep. Ding! Ladies and gentlemen, please wrap up writing your questions. After you've nailed down 2 or 3 questions, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to be moving the flip chart to the pizza room. You're going to start masticating. And while you're masticating, we will take the questions. And in each group, you need to identify the question holder. So establish the role question holder. And question holder holds the questions. And I'll be going through the different question holders and answering the questions as we eat. So let's head over there now.